let's just get right to it. How about we start with you, Xiangyu? You're
Yes,
in Taiwan right now.
that is correct.
We have covered here on this channel uh, Taiwan a lot. The latest developments we had in August of last year, Nancy Pelosi's visit. We just had Kevin McCarthy meet with Tsai Ing-wen out in California not too long ago. And then we had Blinken's visit. He visited Beijing. He met with all the high-level officials from Qin Gang, foreign minister, to Wang Yi, the top diplomat, to Xi Jinping. And there was supposed to be a stabilization of relations. And uh, Blinken said he was reaffirming the one China principle. But just today, Chinese officials came out with statements to the media saying that, well, the U.S. is saying one thing and doing another. And then you had Biden call Xi Jinping a dictator just a day after Blinken left. Could you, from your perspective out now on the province of Taiwan, what are your reactions to this, and what should people know to understand these developments?
I'm going to say something controversial.
All right.
Taiwan separatism is basically like an attack dog on a leash. They're not serious about actually going all the way. The current status quo, I think there is some truth to Blinken saying, we do not support Taiwan independence, as in they'll support anything short of a formal declaration, because Taiwan, the role that Taiwan plays in geopolitics from the U.S. perspective is it is a good way to stir tensions with the mainland, right? As we can see now, but in order for that to be useful, this sort of conflict has to be manageable. If you go all the way as to declare formal independence, you're gonna be reunified within a week, to put it bluntly. So, yeah, you have this sort of threat. I mean, because China, for very justifiable reasons, takes our territorial integrity very seriously, and the U.S. knows that, hey, China also happens to not be in a totally reunified state yet, at least internally. So it's going to use that to its advantage. Now, the thing about having an attack dog is when the U.S. wants to pressure Beijing, it'll loosen up the leash just a little bit to annoy Beijing, make Beijing uncomfortable, make Beijing want to react and talk. But at the same time, when the U.S. is ready to sit down and have some concessions, it'll tighten up the leash just a little bit to show goodwill in this sort of manipulator, abuser type of way. So that's my whole take of the situation. And I think what's really noteworthy is the fact that Blinken visited around the time Bill Gates, Jensen Huang, and top executives from TSMC visited. So, take what you will from that.
So, JingJing, I wanted to get you in here from Beijing, from the mainland. I mean, could you, what is the basis for China's position, on Taiwan? I mean, I feel like it's often dismissed, and all we hear in the mainstream media out here in the United States and in the rest of the collective West is China is preparing to invade. China is aggressive. I mean, what is the perspective from China's side?
So, very happy to come back. So, I think me and Xiangyu and a few other guests, we discussed this a lot. China's officials have been saying this every year, all the time, that Taiwan issue is the core interest. It's the core of the core interest of China. It's the red line, cannot be crossed. It's the basis for formulating a diplomatic relationship with any country in the world. So that means every country that has a diplomatic relations with China recognize Taiwan is part of China. It's written on State Department, on every country. So it's interesting then the public have a different view. On the government level, they recognize Taiwan as part of China. But how come but the public has a different understanding? And then that because of the huge role that a Western mainstream media played. They constantly play the word game, always depicting Chinese mainland and Taiwan as two separate things. So gradually they are brainwashing people, putting the idea into the public that they're different. when the U.S. politicians, when the West, when people say China gonna invade Taiwan, it's hilarious. How can you invade the territory that belongs to you? And then, of course, Chinese mainland and Taiwan, there are issues, but that's the result of the civil war between CPC and the KMT. And also, like all the problems between Chinese mainland and Taiwan, the United States has always been playing a huge part from the civil war. The United States at first want to sponsor the KMT because they want to defeat the CPC, and so they've been supporting the separatism. They've been supporting Chiang Kai-shek KMT back then, and then when the world recognized People's Republic of China, they found, oh, okay, so KMT and Taiwan is just no use. They dumped Taiwan, started a formal diplomatic relationship with the mainland, recognized People's Republic of China. So, I mean, they're always playing with each other. So, I mean, what happens to now, America has a huge role in creating these conflicts between Chinese mainland and Taiwan. But I can assure you from the government to the people, everyone on the Chinese mainland want to reunify with Taiwan. No one can accept the separatism. That is the base. This is a fundamental principle.
And Xiangyu, could you maybe go over some of that basis? You've talked a lot about the history here. JingJing brought it up, that there is a huge historical basis to this, but here in the United States, when you hear someone like even Antony Blinken talk after his meeting, even though he was affirming the one China principle, there isn't much explanation as to what that is. Heck, the State Department rarely talks about the joint communiques. Actually, during this visit, he mentioned them, and I don't remember the last time the Biden administration mentioned that there are 3 joint communiques that affirm the one China principle. So could you go over some of that history? Like, why is it a red line for China, as JingJing mentioned?
I think something that's confusing to people is if you look at Chinese history, it's not at all unusual for remnants of an old dynasty or an old regime to still exist when a new one is formed. And I would go further to say that although 1949 was the year that the People's Republic of China was established, even before then, large swaths of Chinese territory were controlled by the Communist Party. When a new dynasty or government is declared, what it means is the tide's basically not turning back. Even in October 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the people's government, even parts of the mainland like Guangxi, Guizhou, Yunnan were still under KMT control. So you use that sort of logic to understand why Taiwan is not under direct CPC control, and it's not that ridiculous. It's kind of like how the Mongol Yuan dynasty is recognized to have fallen in 1368 when they were defeated by the Ming dynasty. But the remnants of the Yuan dynasty still existed as a rump state in what's now parts of Russia, Mongolia, and northern China's Inner Mongolia. And they even claim to still possess the mandate of heaven until 1636, until their leader handed over the imperial seal to the Qing. So the Taiwan situation is kind of like that, except now in today's geopolitics, you have a United States that's willing to use all sorts of contradictions to further its foreign policy goals, especially regarding China. And the other unfortunate thing is separatism rose in Taiwan because the KMT kind of failed to win over the people. It carried out very brutal martial law. And the reason why a lot of anti-China propaganda is so believable to people in Taiwan is because a lot of the stuff that they claim was actually done by the KMT back then. And guess where the KMT learned it from? None other than the CIA. And so you had this sort of liberal opposition that arose against the KMT because the KMT governed Taiwan for the first few decades. It was here as a bunch of out-of-touch elites from the mainland. And it so happened that so Chiang Kai-shek learned some difficult lessons on the mainland, so when he came over here to Taiwan, he carried out land reform, and land reform is good. But when you carry out land reform, you typically screw over people who are traditionally powerful. And although they were sidelined from the top echelons of power until the 1980s. Yeah, they kind of wanted back into power because when the Japanese colonized us, they were kind of co-opted and they enjoyed certain rights and privileges that the KMT deprived them of. So they felt like that's just the way things should be. So when the liberal opposition movement happened, they seized upon the opportunity. And that's why you have people like Tsai Ing-wen, with her politics, and her father actually was what we call a Huangmin. Huangmin is, you go through this process to renounce your Chinese heritage and you adopt a new set of fake Japanese ancestors. And you're allowed to do this if you meet certain requirements like practicing Shinto, speaking Japanese at home, basically being Japanese. So it afforded you this formal status that put you above other people in Taiwan. But I mean, in the eyes of Japanese people, you were still a store brand Japanese. So yeah,
I
the
can
many
add
layers of
something to that.
contradictions.
Yeah, just because what Xiangyu said is very important, because there's a huge misunderstanding between Chinese mainland and Taiwan. Because whenever you talk to Western people, they will ask, "Oh, what about Taiwan? How do people in Taiwan feel?" So there are there are a great number of people in Taiwan that probably don't like Chinese mainland, probably don't like CPC. And this huge misunderstanding because of several reasons, and some already Xiangyu already said, but it comes from, correct me if I said anything wrong, Xiangyu. So there are several different reasons that we have huge gap of understanding, even though we are all Chinese. We speak Chinese. We most of the immigrants in Taiwan come from different provinces in the mainland. First, during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese have very different behaviors in the mainland and Taiwan. In the mainland, they committed all kinds of atrocities. So all the Chinese on the mainland hate the Japanese, hate their occupation, of course. But during that time, Japanese invasion, Japan considered Taiwan as their territory, and the people on Taiwan Island as their citizens. So they have a different set of rules. They treat them as their second-class citizens. So many people in Taiwan during the Japanese rule, they didn't experience what people in mainland experienced. So some of them probably cannot understand why Chinese people on the mainland hate Japan so much, because during the Japanese rule, they have a different experience. Second, many of the immigrants who immigrated from the mainland to the Taiwan are actually people who fled with KMT. So they have a natural gene to hate CPC. That's why they ran away from the mainland. And so many people on Taiwan, actually, when Japan was defeated and when KMT came, they were happy. I read some many analysis to examine the different attitudes on the Taiwan island. So people on Taiwan actually happy when Japanese left and when KMT, the Chinese people came. But then the KMT have horrible governing skill. They treated people in Taiwan as second-class citizens. They discriminate them, and all this horrible white terror, all this martial law, all these horrible experiences come from the KMT's administration. So the people in Taiwan had a huge disappointment. We thought when we return to our own people, we can be treated better. But the KMT treated them even worse than the Japanese. So they hated KMT. And then third, KMT, they hated CPC. So when they were ruling the Taiwan island, they conducted huge anti-communist propaganda. So they are bad at governing, and then this keeps spreading CPC anti-communist propaganda. So people in Taiwan hate, even though they have no knowledge, no experience with CPC, with no experience of contacting with communism, they already hated that because of KMT's brainwashing. So I mean, all these historical reasons, Japanese rule and the KMT's horrible governing, anti-communist propaganda, so created this how to describe this opinion in Taiwan that even though they would have never been under CPC's rule, they already hated that. They just afraid of that, and also that created this separatism because Tsai Ing-wen and her party DPP, they were born because of KMT's horrible administration. Because it's natural they have the feeling after they were so disappointed by the Japanese, by the KMT, so maybe we just need to rely on ourselves. So even though DPP is rewriting history, many of the things cannot be understood, but it's understandable what this huge misunderstanding were created. So I think many of the things that are happening now, besides America's assistance, is also come from the KMT's horrible administration that created what happened, the huge gap between Chinese mainland and Taiwan.
Well, Xiangyu, I want to get you back in here because it seems like the situation has changed quite a bit. You mentioned that Blinken was there at the same time as Bill Gates, and top executives of TSMC were also in China. And it was Antony Blinken that had to call the Chinese side and say, hey, can we come now? You know, it was not the Chinese side saying, okay, let's mend relations. And so the situation seems to be changing too on Taiwan, on the island where you are now based. What are people's impressions of this threat of war? And also, the KMT swept the elections locally in November 2022. And the DPP is not doing so well politically, which is the party that supports separatism. So could you comment on that in the context of what you've heard from people about U.S.-China tensions over Taiwan?
I think the landslide victory by the KMT last year is not really a sign of people supporting the KMT again. It's more so the people being sick and tired of the DPP and willing to try anything else. Now, people's opinions about the situation, nobody wants war. And you know, I just want to tell a little story that happened in the training center where I was doing my 1-year service in central Taiwan, Nantou. So it's a good distance away from, you know, Taipei and the more cosmopolitan areas of Taiwan. I went to buy urn roasted chicken one day, which you have to try if you ever come to Taiwan. And the owner of that restaurant saw that I was doing my service, so he's like, "Oh, so you're doing your military service?" I'm like, "Well, substitute. I'm not really military." And he's like, "Oh, whatever. You're still serving." So yeah, they changed it back to 1 year. How do you feel about that? And I was just like, well, I was born in 1993, so I was gonna do 1 year anyways. So basically, 1993 is people born 1993 and before have always had to do 1 year. It was people born after 1994 that did 4 months, and the new change affects people born 2005 and after. So it really doesn't affect me. So he was like, yeah, you know, I think the U.S. is trying to turn us into Ukraine. So he said that, so I kind of pushed the envelope a little bit, and I said, yeah, Zelensky is Biden's little somebody you pay for services, to put it nicely. Yeah, and he was like, yeah, how so? I was like, so that explained. I'm like, yeah, he says he's fighting for Ukraine, but all I see him doing is maintaining his power at the expense of the Ukrainian people, sending them to their deaths while the country keeps on, you know, getting worse and worse. And Russia's not, and the Russian threat, what they consider to be the Russian threat, isn't really going away. And the owner of the restaurant was like, I can see Taiwan doing that to us. So people aren't necessarily, you know, don't see this as people just automatically being super pro CPC, because that takes time. But people's opinions are changing and they want a way out of this bad situation, because the DPP hasn't had much policy successes since it came to power in 2016. If you factor out TSMC from our economic growth data, our economic growth is actually negative. But what they do to maintain support among the younger activists is they spend a lot of money to increase Taiwan's visibility in international media. as you can see, because now everybody knows about Taiwan, whereas before they couldn't tell the difference between Taiwan and Thailand. And I kind of miss those days when people didn't really know much about Taiwan because it was less annoying. They do that, but at the end of the day, this stuff can only last so long. It's a house of cards. Things are getting more expensive. You had the egg situation that America experienced, though to a lesser extent, and people's pay isn't rising. And now on top of that, there's a threat of war, and people intuitively know, hey, what we want is to have a better livelihood. We want to have a better future for our kids. People intuitively know that becoming human shields and cannon fodder for a war that doesn't really benefit them, it goes against those goals.